The Palace of Versailles was born from a dream King Louis the Fourteenth built with gold, mirrors, and control. He wanted to blind the world with his brilliance and trap his nobles beneath his light. At first, Versailles looked like paradise. Endless gardens, crystal chandeliers, and walls that glowed like sunrise. But beneath that glittering skin, the palace began to rot. There were no toilets in the halls of heaven, just corners reeking of human waste. Rats scurried across banquet floors, feasting on crumbs from royal plates. Perfume tried to hide the stench, but the air was thick, a sweet, choking mix of flowers and decay. The marble floors turned slick with grime. The fountains stank of death. And what began as a monument to perfection became the most magnificent nightmare in history. Today, we uncover the rise, the rot, and the fall of Versailles, the palace that tried to outshine the sun itself. In 1649, when Louis was only 11, mobs in Paris stormed the royal palace. They shouted insults at his mother and smashed windows near the room where the young king slept. From that night forward, he never forgot the sound of ordinary people rebelling. He learned to hate the city that had frightened him. When he grew up, he swore that power and safety would come from distance. He would build a world where no one could reach him. That world would become Versailles. The site was nothing special at first, just a hunting lodge in the middle of marshland, built by his father, Louis the 13th. The ground was damp, the air thick with mosquitoes, and the nearest clean spring lay miles away. But isolation was exactly what Louis wanted. A palace there would keep the nobles close and the people far. It would remind everyone that France itself revolved around him, the Sun King. He ordered construction in 1661. Thousands of workers arrived, stonemasons, carpenters, gardeners, sculptors, and soldiers who had traded their muskets for shovels. They drained the swamps, dug canals, and hauled marble across the countryside. Many died from fever, accidents, or exhaustion. No one dared complain. Versailles was to be the mirror of heaven, and heaven demanded sacrifice. Louis the 14th hired the same team who built Louis the Vicomte, the lavish mansion of his finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet. That palace's splendor had enraged the king, who saw it as an insult. After imprisoning Fouquet, Louis took his architects and artists to create something far greater, Versailles. Every inch of the new palace was designed to glorify him. The gardens formed rays that spread outward like sunlight. The ceilings showed gods bowing to his image. Even the furniture followed rules of symmetry and control. Versailles wasn't just a home, it was propaganda made of stone. But the dream was bigger than the plan. Entire villages emptied to supply workers. Forests vanished to feed the furnaces that forged iron gates and gold leaf. The treasury bled silver, yet the king's vision never wavered. He believed that beauty itself was proof of divine favor. By 1682, the project was ready enough for the Great Migration. Louis ordered the entire royal court, thousands of nobles and their families, to abandon Paris and move into his masterpiece. To them, it seemed an honor. To him, it was strategy. At Versailles, he could watch them all. He turned ambition into entertainment. Morning rituals, dinners, ballets, endless ceremonies. Each one kept the nobles occupied and dependent on his favor. They lived in gold cages, competing for a single glance from the king. The trap worked perfectly, but it also created something Louis never intended: chaos behind the curtains. The palace had been built for beauty, not survival. The pipes were decorative. The drains ended abruptly in gravel. There was no plumbing, no sewers, and hardly any latrines. The courtiers arrived with trunks of silk and jewels, not buckets and soap. Within weeks, the marble floors were stained. Servants carried chamber pots through corridors packed with powdered wigs and perfume. Every evening, hundreds of candles filled the air with smoke, while waste buckets filled the air with something worse. Outside, the gardens dazzled the eye. Hundreds of fountains spraying water in patterns that spelled power. Inside, there was no running water at all. What water existed came from the same ponds that fed the fountains, thick with algae and insects. Cooks boiled it for soups and tea. The smell alone could turn a stomach, yet appearances had to be maintained. Courtiers covered their bodies in powder and musk. They burned incense in every room. stuffed herbs into pockets, and pinned flowers to their wigs. One visitor wrote that entering Versailles felt like stepping into a perfume shop built on a sewer. Servants swept constantly, but it never ended. The marble absorbed moisture, the air stayed heavy. In summer, the heat turned the palace into an oven. In winter, freezing drafts cut through every crack, but fires only made the smell worse. Smoke and stench mixed until the halls seemed to breathe. Still, the rituals continued. Every morning, Louis performed his lever, the rising. Courtiers crowded his bedroom to watch him wake, dress, and eat. They bowed, whispered, and fought for the right to hand him his gloves or pour his chocolate. The chamber glittered with mirrors and gilt, but beneath the perfume lingered the odor of bodies that rarely bathed. Few noticed anymore. They had trained themselves not to. Bathing was rare because doctors warned it could kill. They believed hot water opened the pores and invited disease. Cleanliness, they said, was dangerous. So people dabbed themselves with scented cloths instead. The king himself reportedly took only a handful of baths in his lifetime. To compensate, he surrounded himself with fountains and perfume, symbols of purity that required no water at all. Versailles became a paradox, a palace dedicated to order that produced nothing but waste. The servants bore the worst of it. They slept in narrow attics under the roof or in windowless basements beside the kitchens. Some lived inside hollow walls behind nobles' rooms so they could respond instantly when called. Rats were constant companions. The smell of spoiled food mixed with candle smoke and sweat until even the cats fled. They worked from dawn until long after midnight, polishing mirrors, scrubbing floors, carrying pots of human waste through corridors lined with courtiers pretending not to see them. One wrong step or a spilled bucket could ruin a career. Yet they were invisible. Outside, the glory spread. Foreign ambassadors arrived in awe. Painters immortalized the gardens, poets praised the architecture. Kings across Europe tried to copy it. None of them saw the reality. The illusion was perfect. Versailles looked like a dream, and Louis made sure it stayed that way. But the dream was hungry. It devoured money, labor, and lives. The king taxed his people to keep the fountains running and the candles lit. Villages starved so that Versailles could shine. As years passed, even loyal subjects began to murmur. Yet Louis believed the palace would justify everything. "I am the state," he said. And in his mind, the state was flawless. He was wrong. By the 1680s, the number of residents had tripled. The palace creaked under the strain. Water supplies ran dry, fires broke out, and disease spread through the servants' quarters. Dysentery, typhus, fevers, each claimed hundreds every year. When the wells turned foul, the king ordered barrels of wine for drinking instead of fixing the problem. The court toasted his generosity while vomiting into golden basins. The Sun King never saw the irony. Every attempt to improve the palace made things worse. New wings meant new corridors and new places to hide waste. More fountains meant less water for cleaning. The grandeur that had once stunned Europe now suffocated it. Even Louis's own body began to rebel. In his final years, he suffered from abscesses, ulcers, and infections that filled the palace with the same smell he'd tried to escape as a child. The courtiers continued to bow and smile, pretending nothing was wrong. But the odor told the truth. The king and his creation were decaying together. When he died in 1715, mourners filled the chapel. They said the air grew sweeter when the coffin was sealed. For a moment, it seemed Versailles might finally rest. But the rot he left behind would keep spreading for generations. When Louis the Fourteenth's body was carried from Versailles, the people of Paris rang church bells in celebration, not grief. The Sun King had burned for 72 years, and his light had scorched the land. The courtiers mourned because they didn't know how to live without him. The servants didn't mourn at all, they just kept cleaning. The new king, Louis the 15th, was only 5. Regents and ministers ruled in his name, but the palace kept breathing the same heavy air. Versailles was too large to abandon, too symbolic to replace. It had become a living thing, part monument, part monster. Every wall whispered its history. Every stone held the smell of the past. As the boy grew, he inherited not only a kingdom, but a problem that could not be fixed. The pipes were clogged, the wells contaminated, and the foundations sinking into the old marshland. Repairs cost more than new wars. Ministers begged him to move the court back to Paris, but pride chained him to the golden prison his great-grandfather had built. Leaving would mean admitting that the Sun King had been wrong, so Versailles endured, shimmering on the surface and rotting underneath. During the young king's first years, the courtiers hoped for a gentler reign. They got something stranger. Louis the 15th loved luxury but hated ceremony. He avoided the crowds that once surrounded his ancestor, preferring small gatherings in private apartments. The palace grew quieter, but not cleaner. The nobles still lived in their narrow chambers, separated from servants by only thin wooden walls. Waste soaked the floors. Perfumes filled the air. The contradiction deepened. Versailles smelled like a bouquet left too long in the heat. Sweet at first, then foul. Servants dumped chamber pots into hidden courtyards called Cours des Miracles. Rain washed the filth into the fountains. When the fountains sprayed again, they spread the stench across the gardens. Visitors complained, and gardeners sprinkled herbs around the statues to disguise the odor. At night, rats came out by the hundreds, feeding on crumbs from royal banquets. Cats were supposed to hunt them, but many cats ended up stuffed under skirts as pets instead. The battle was lost before it began. Still, the parties continued. Louis the 15th filled the halls with music and laughter. The courtiers danced, flirted, and gambled while the walls oozed dampness behind the tapestries. The palace became a contradiction made flesh, beauty built on mold. Foreign diplomats marveled at the mirrors and pretended not to gag. They wrote home about a kingdom that glittered like a corpse dusted in gold. The king's mistresses brought brief bursts of color. One, Madame de Pompadour, transformed entire wings into salons of art and philosophy. She invited poets, musicians, and thinkers to breathe new life into Versailles. They discussed virtue and enlightenment while stepping carefully over the filth in the corridors. She commissioned perfumes so strong they made guests dizzy. Every candle and ribbon hid another crack in the dream. Its fashions spread faster than its diseases. Nobles copied its hairstyles, its architecture, even its etiquette. They didn't realize they were copying its sickness, too. The French court had turned decay into style. The worse things smelled, the more perfume people wore. The dirtier the water, the more wine they drank. Comfort became weakness. Denial became elegance. The servants knew better. They were the ones who carried away the waste, cleaned the lice from wigs, and scraped wax from marble floors. They saw the truth daily and whispered it to each other in the dark. Some said the palace was cursed, that the Sun King's ghost still wandered the halls looking for the purity he'd lost. Others joked that if you dropped a coin in the fountains, it would come back smelling of hell. Diseases followed. Fevers swept through the kitchens and laundries, then crept upward to the noble rooms. Doctors blamed miasmas, bad air, but did nothing to remove it. They prescribed lavender water and prayers. The priests blessed the corridors. The smell remained. By the 1750s, cracks appeared in the walls. The gardens began to fade. Even the statues seemed tired. Versailles was aging faster than its king. When Pompadour died, the court wept as though beauty itself had gone with her. Without her energy, the palace felt heavier. Louis the 15th withdrew further into private rooms filled with portraits of women and birds in cages. He ignored the complaints of ministers and the laughter of foreign guests who mocked his decaying home. Then came the scandal on the staircase, the moment when illusions slipped. A ball was underway, chandeliers blazing. The mistress's successors glided past the crowd, all silk and diamonds. Then a sudden gasp, a shriek, and silence. Madame de Pompadour's successor, ascending in triumph, had stepped in human waste. It squelched under her heel, staining her white shoe brown. For a heartbeat, the orchestra froze. Then, as always, it played on. Etiquette demanded blindness. The courtiers danced while servants rushed to scrub the step. The next morning, a new rule was issued. Light shoes were no longer allowed in the palace. No one mentioned why. That was Versailles in a single moment, a world that changed its rules instead of cleaning its floors. As years passed, the stench of denial thickened. The king grew older, slower, more detached. Ministers fought over taxes, the people outside starved. Inside, nobles still powdered their faces and argued about fashion. They believed that as long as the mirrors shone, the kingdom would survive. They couldn't smell the truth anymore. The palace had trained them too well. When Louis the 15th died in 1774, his body was carried out quickly and buried quietly. The people cheered again. They said the wind smelled cleaner that day. But nothing inside the palace had changed. The walls still breathed the same heavy air. The inheritance passed to a young couple who thought they could save it, Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette. The new queen, Marie Antoinette, arrived from Austria, young, radiant, and full of hope. She was barely a teenager and found the palace both breathtaking and unbearable. She complained of the cold, the crowding, and the lack of privacy. "It is magnificent and filthy," she wrote to her mother. Her words were truer than she knew. She ordered small improvements, baths, new fabrics, better ventilation, but every fix exposed another problem. Workers opening a wall found decades of waste sealed behind it. Replacing the pipes released smells so vile that courtiers fled in horror. Yet the queen persisted. She wanted cleanliness, not extravagance. She wanted to breathe. But outside Versailles, France was choking. The treasury was empty, the people were hungry. When word spread that the queen had built private bathrooms lined with marble, the rumor changed shape. In the streets of Paris, they said she was bathing in milk while children starved. Her efforts at hygiene turned into symbols of greed. Reality no longer mattered. The palace's filth had become metaphor. By the 1780s, the contrast between Versailles and France was unbearable. Pamphlets mocked the court as a nest of parasites. Caricatures showed nobles perfumed and powdered while standing in muck. The palace that had once defined beauty now defined corruption. Its stench had escaped its walls and entered history. Outside the gates, the air smelled of bread riots and revolution. Inside, the candles still burned and the orchestra still played. The nobles laughed a little louder, trying to drown out the whispers. But everyone knew something was coming. You could almost smell it. And when it came, it would not be perfume. The drums of Paris could be heard faintly even at Versailles, though the courtiers pretended it was only distant thunder. Bread prices tripled. Farmers starved. Rumors spread that the king still held lavish feasts beneath chandeliers made of diamonds. Inside the palace, the air was as heavy as ever, perfumed, smoky, and suffocating. Outside, it smelled of anger. On October 5th, 1789, that anger arrived in the flesh. Thousands of women from Paris marched the long road to Versailles carrying pikes, kitchen knives, and loaves of stale bread tied to poles. They demanded to see the king. When the gates opened, the crowd surged forward, pouring into the golden courtyard that had once been forbidden ground. They looked around in disbelief. The miracle of Versailles had been a lie, and the people saw it all at once. The royal guards tried to hold them back. The mob burst through doors and hallways until they stood in the Hall of Mirrors itself, gazing at their own ragged reflections beside the glittering chandeliers. Some laughed, some cried. One woman spat on the floor and said, "So this is what we paid for." Another muttered, "It smells like death." She wasn't wrong. By morning, the royal family was gone, escorted to Paris under armed guard. Versailles was left behind like a carcass. Servants fled, fires burned out, and silence fell. The gardens withered, the fountains stopped. What had once been a symbol of divine order now stood empty, its marble bones exposed to the wind. The revolutionaries who followed didn't want to live there, they wanted to cleanse it. Teams of workers arrived with shovels, carts, and lime. What they found shocked even them. Behind paneling, they uncovered piles of waste sealed in by carpenters generations earlier. Under staircases, they found buckets turned to stone with age. In the attics, they found the mummified remains of rats and cats that had died decades before. It took months to clear it all. One worker wrote in his diary, "The stench is enough to make a man believe in hell." They burned what they could: carpets, drapes, bedding that no perfume could save. The rest they dragged outside and buried in pits near the forest. When they were done, the palace looked clean again. But the smell lingered in the pores of the stone. Versailles had soaked up its own corruption. It would never truly be rid of it. For a brief moment, some revolutionaries argued that the palace should be destroyed, ground to dust as a warning to future kings. Others wanted to turn it into a school for the people, a place where ordinary citizens could learn what the monarchy had hidden. In the end, practical men decided it was too expensive to demolish. The revolution had more urgent work: war, famine, rebuilding. Versailles was abandoned, left to rot quietly while France tried to reinvent itself. Rain leaked through the roofs. Birds nested in the rafters. The mirrors clouded with mildew. In winter, frost crept across the marble floors like a white fungus. The silence was total. For the first time in over a century, no music echoed through its halls. The Palace of Noise had become a tomb. When the French Revolution ended, Versailles became a ghost of itself. The laughter vanished, the perfumes faded, but the walls remained. Napoleon visited once in 1804, called it too royal, and left it to rot. For years, it was nothing more than a hollow monument, a haunted echo of power, still beautiful, still dangerous. But France couldn't let it die. By the 1800s, they decided to turn the ruin into a museum, a temple not to kings but to history. Workers scrubbed, polished, and repainted. The filth disappeared, replaced by marble and oil paint. Visitors came from across the world, marveling at its perfection, never realizing it was perfection built on denial. Versailles was reborn as a lie polished clean. In 1919, world leaders gathered in the Hall of Mirrors to sign the Treaty of Versailles, the same room where Louis the Fourteenth had once glittered like a god. The war ended, but the seeds of the next one were sown right there beneath those chandeliers. When the Germans returned during World War II, they walked those same halls, the conquerors now standing where their ancestors once knelt. And when the war ended again, France restored the palace once more, scrubbing away the evidence of everything it had witnessed. Today, the palace gleams. The mirrors shine, the air smells of wax and flowers, and tourists pose beneath painted ceilings of angels. But beneath the floors lies the truth that never fades, the bones of a civilization that destroyed itself, trying to look perfect. Versailles is spotless now, yet haunted, not by ghosts, but by irony. Because Versailles isn't just about France, it's about us. Every age builds its own version of it. Skyscrapers, mansions, glowing skylines. Every generation believes its illusion will last, but it never does. The Sun King's disease still lives on. Glitter first, rot later. Versailles shows what happens when appearance replaces compassion. Its kings built gold walls to hide human need, and for a while, it worked, until the smell of truth became too strong to ignore. When the revolutionaries stormed the gates, they didn't just end a dynasty, they exposed a metaphor. The palace that claimed divine perfection was literally filled with waste. The rich had been choking on their own perfume and calling it paradise. That's why Versailles still matters. It reminds us that beauty without empathy is decay wearing a crown. That power without humanity always ends in rot. Stand in the Hall of Mirrors long enough, and you'll see yourself reflected hundreds of times. Not a king, but a descendant of both those who ruled and those who served. Versailles doesn't just tell France's story, it tells ours. It's not just history, it's prophecy. A palace that whispers to every visitor. Every empire smells the same before it falls.